How's it going, guys? My name is Lee Woodmansee, and I'm the campus minister here at the Baptist Collegiate Ministry at the University of Arkansas Fort Smith. I'm glad you've joined in with watching this video of where we are addressing a pretty basic question I get pretty frequently. So I figured it was a good idea to just record this simple video to kind of walk through how to choose which Bible you should read. Before we get into that content, though, what I want to do is make sure that you're following along with everything that we've got going on at the BCM by looking at our social media. Make sure that you are subscribed and following, and make sure you have notifications turned on so that we can stay informed on everything that's going to be going on. So this is the impetus behind this this recording. I feel like there's been a lot of information that floats around about what Bible you should read. There's frankly a lot of pride in the way that people address which Bible translation they read. But I think a lot of times we don't even know why that is. And so I want to address some of those things right now, simply because I feel like there just needs to be some questions that are just basically answered about how the Bible is actually put together. And once we understand those foundational type things, then we can get into seeing some of the deeper issues about how to choose within with more information about what Bible you should be reading on a day in and day out basis. So here's the first thing that we really want to address is what language is the Bible written in? So I want to start there because I feel like this is something that we may not actually be all that well up on because there actually is some pretty clear implications about what it is that we're going to do as a result of knowing what translation to use and how the Bible is actually put together. So the short answer is, the Old Testament is written primarily in Hebrew. When I say primarily, I mean like overwhelmingly. There are a few Aramaic passages, specifically in Daniel, but generally it's written in Hebrew. The New Testament, however, is written in Greek. Both of those are a little bit different from each other, and so if you've never seen what that really looks like, I want to show you. I want to pull up my desktop here so you can kind of see what we're talking about here. So this is from Numbers chapter 26, verse 1. This is when the new census is going to be taken there in Numbers. This is what Hebrew actually looks like. Now, for most people, this is not something that they are going to be familiar with at all, with even knowing what it's looking like, and I highlight that in purposefully. Hebrew is written from right to left, so you would actually start reading from this end going that direction. And so what we're actually looking at here is what we would call a interlinear, and we'll get into that here in just a little bit. But this is what Hebrew actually looks like, and this is what the Old Testament is written in. However, when you get to the New Testament, you have this, and this is from John chapter 1, verse 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. This is what Greek looks like there, and this is a very more familiar Western-style language, so you would read it from left to right. So the reason this is important is because we have to understand something about translation. Whenever I was taking my Latin, whenever I was in my undergraduate studies, one of the things that I had one of my instructors really harp on was what actually happens in translation. And the phrase that he would always use is that translation is deformation. Now, what I mean by that is not that we are manipulating a text in a difficult way so that it doesn't actually say what it says. Like, it just means that by nature, there are things that when you translate, it doesn't come out the way that you would speak on a daily basis. You have deformed what the original author or the original speaker has said. Think of it this way. Translation doesn't work like it's a machine where you put 5 or 6 Hebrew words in or Greek words in, you turn a crank, and then 5 or 6 English words spit out, and it's a 1-for-1 correlation. Like, that just doesn't work that way. That's not how translation works today. Even going from familiar languages like French and Spanish and German into English, much less whenever you get into tonal languages like Mandarin or Cantonese, things just kind of get sideways on us. That's the nature of translation. So one of the things that we really need to address then is exactly how is the Bible translated then? If we have languages that the Bible was originally written in that we don't speak, well, then we need to understand exactly how the Bible was translated. And so you can get into a whole lot of in-depth studies here about how Bible translations, especially modern translations, were originally translated. A lot of it goes back modeled after Jerome was the guy who wrote what we would call the Latin Vulgate. He took the Greek text of the New Testament and put it into Latin, the vulgar tongue, the common tongue that most people spoke. So Jerome wrote the Latin Vulgate, and so the way that other translators have approached reading the Bible and then translating it into another language has been very similar. That's not necessarily the topic here, but what I want to address is the method in which we actually translate. If we did have that machine where we dumped 5 or 6 Greek or 5 or 6 Hebrew words, we turn a crank, and then a couple of English words spit out, there's a couple of different ways you can do that. And so that really brings us to this really critical question and this really critical idea of the difference between dynamic and formal equivalence. Now, formal equivalence is what it sounds like. I have 5 or 6 Greek or Hebrew words, I put them in the machine, I turn the crank, and then 5 or 6 English words come out one for one. A lot of times this is called word for word translation. Dynamic translation or dynamic equivalency is a little bit different because it tries to massage the text a little bit so that it actually comes out in a way that we would recognize it today. In idioms would translate a little bit differently. Different phrases that come out in the Bible would sound more familiar to us in the dynamic equivalency. And so what I want to do is I want to bring up on my desktop yet again another little chart for us that I think would be a little helpful for us in understanding exactly what we're talking about here with this dynamic and formal equivalency. And so what we have here is a graph, basically, this formal or dynamic equivalency. This is the word for word range, and this is the thought for thought. This is where we have different translations of the Bible that fall along this spectrum. I mentioned earlier the interlinear. An interlinear is where you have the Latin, or excuse me, where it could be Latin. It could be whatever language, but specifically it's typically Hebrew or Greek, written out by line, by verse, and then underneath it you have a one-for-one or a word-for-word translation into English. That's where an interlinear falls into. So that's a formal or word for word because it's literally trying to take every single individual word and show you where they line up. Does that make sense? So, on the rest of this scale here, there's a couple of translations I really want to highlight. So this guy right here, that's the King James Version, right? That's the one that's from 1611, that is probably the most culturally iconic biblical translation in English, and that's the King James Version. Other common versions, we have the New American Standard Bible, the NASB, the English Standard Version, the ESV, the New King James Version, the Christian Standard Bible, or it used to be the Holman Christian Standard. That's the Southern Baptist Convention Bible. A lot of people kind of think of it that way. The New International Version, the New Living Translation, the Living Bible, and the Message. Right? Those are some pretty basic, familiar translations that you would actually run across. But I do want to throw out there another category. Whenever you get to this end of the spectrum where you're talking about the Living Bible and the Message or the Amplified Bible, those are not translations. As clearly as I can say, those are paraphrases. They have actually not done any work whatsoever in translating anything. What they have done is they have taken an English text that was already a translation, so they would take a text that's based off of like the ESV or the New American Standard or the REV or something along those lines, and they would take that English and they would rephrase it or paraphrase it into other language that people could commonly understand. So when you get down to this end of the spectrum of the dynamic end, you can actually slip into what we would call a paraphrase. And without passing judgment one way or another, what I would say is you need to be very careful about reading that as your daily devotional time, as your daily study Bible. If you're preaching and teaching out of those translations, that's a problem because it's not a translation, it's a paraphrase. You've gotten not just one, but several steps away from the actual text that the biblical authors wrote down. So with that being said, I feel like this kind of gives us a basic idea of understanding, yes, the languages are written in Hebrew and Greek, and they have to go through this process of translation, whether it's formal or dynamic equivalency. And here are some examples of where those translations fall. So this is where I want to ask another question that I feel like might be beneficial for us. And I think this might hit home for some of us. Is there anything wrong with the King James Version? And what we see here is that on the scale, it actually is pretty close to the formal end. Like the midway point is kind of right here near the NIV of fairly balanced between formal and dynamic. And the King James is way over on this side of the scale where we talk about the formal word for word. So is there anything wrong with that translation? I would answer that two ways. One, there is absolutely nothing wrong with the translation of the King James Version of the Bible in 1611 whatsoever. It is a fine translation for 400 years ago. It uses language that is 400 years ago. The Tyndale version of the Bible, or the Wycliffe Bible rather, was written in what we would call Middle English. There is Old English, which is like Beowulf. Middle English is like the Wycliffe Bible translation. And then you have King James, which is like the early-ish stages of modern English. It is easier to read the King James than it is the Wycliffe Bible. But let me say this. If you go to the Wycliffe Bible and you today as a modern reader were trying to read that English, you would not even be able to pronounce some of the words. You wouldn't even understand it. This translation of the King James is actually closer in time to Middle English than it is to us. It's 400 years old. There's two problems with that. One, it has a lot of these and thous in there that we just don't understand how that works, as whether it is the object or the subject of a sentence. And sometimes we just don't even do the calculus in our head as we're reading to understand who is being spoken to and who is being spoken of. So that's one of the problems with the King James. It's 400 years old. It's difficult to understand. The second thing that I would say about the problem with the King James is that it is 400 years old, and we have found older and better, as in more reliable, manuscripts in Hebrew and in Greek since then. If I am going to ask you to get to the closest understanding of the text from what the author originally wrote, you would want something that is closer in time to the actual author. You would want something that's more reliably connected to what the author originally wrote. The King James Version uses certain texts from the Old Testament and the New that are just old. They're not as good of manuscripts. The evidence for their reliability is just not as good, right? So let me answer it two ways. One, is there anything wrong with the King James Bible? No, there's nothing wrong with it if it's 1611. The problem is, second way I would answer it is, we're not in 1611. We're in 2020. And that means that there have been changes in the way that we even use English. There have been changes in the documents that we even use, the manuscripts that we have translated from. And so for that reason, I can't recommend for us to actually use the King James Bible. That being said, if you are really doggedly attached to that, and I'm not saying that like in a mean, evil-spirited kind of way, but if you are really attached to that, then what I would ask you to do is, instead of reading the King James Version, why not just read the New King James? The New King James uses the exact same translational style, trying to be formal equivalence in this word-for-word idea of translation. It tries to stay very faithful to the text, but what it has done is updated the language so that it doesn't sound like you're reading Shakespeare, right? How many of y'all had trouble whenever you were in high school, if you had in an English literature class where you like went around the room and read Romeo and Juliet and you're sweating bullets because you don't know how to read that English? Well, the New King James Version basically removes most of those hurdles for us. So, again, is there anything wrong with it? Not necessarily. It's just old. And if that's true, there are better translations out there for us. And so now that brings us to the real question, and primarily what this video is about is, which translation then should I read? If the King James Version is old and there's problems with it, okay, well then what should I read? Let me just kind of pull up this chart one more time. I think a lot of it really depends on what you're looking to get out of the Bible. If you are new to reading the Bible, I think having something that is a very wooden, is a word that gets used for formal or word-for-word translations, that's not going to be the best method for you. When I first started seriously studying the Bible, I read the New American Standard Bible. That's this Bible right here. It has the New American Standard in it, but also what it has is what we call a parallel Bible. It has the Message right next to it. So it has the exact same passage in English in the New American Standard, and then right next to it is the Message. So whenever I was reading Old Testament texts, there were a lot of times that I had difficulty understanding what the language actually said from the New American Standard, just because I was just new to reading the Bible and I wasn't acclimated to reading that style of literature. And so I had the Message. So what I had is literally on both ends of the spectrum. I had the New American Standard and I had the Message in one Bible that I would use for my translations that I would read from. So if you are new to reading the Bible, maybe you should get something that's over on the dynamic end. Something like the New International Version is a great translation. I would go with the older one where they have the gender specific pronouns, the he, she, and it, as opposed to just generally it or they, just because there's more precision there, and I think it's more faithful to the original texts. The New International Version is a good translation. There's a reason why it's beloved. The Holman Christian Standard, or the Christian Standard Bible, the CSB, is right there in the middle. It does a very good job of retaining the basic idea and word for word, but also in the thoughts, it comes across and smooths out the translations. The ESV is primarily what I read from on a daily basis. It's what I teach from. However, all that being said, there are all sorts of translations that you can use. In fact, I have an assortment of Bibles that I physically have right here next to me. I've already shown you one parallel Bible that I have, and this is one of my other favorite ones. This is actually, I think, my wife's that I ganked from her several years ago. This is a parallel Bible that has 4 different translations, and what it has is the New American Standard, it has the NIV, the New International Version, it has the King James, and it has the New Living. So it actually covers kind of that range. If you want the old English, or excuse me, the older version of English, you've got the King James right there for us. And then you have an updated version that's easier to understand than the New International. Then you have the New Living, which is more along the lines of that paraphrase. And then you have that word for word, very formal equivalent translation in the New American Standard there as well, all in one Bible. Now, this dude's a pretty big, hefty guy, but that's a Bible there that I think would be beneficial for us. Other texts that are, or excuse me, other Bibles that are important, man, I have an NIV. When I just want to read from the NIV, if I'm trying to do some teaching at a youth group that is dealing with a difficult text that doesn't really smooth out real well in English, then I'll go to the NIV and teach from that. If I want to use the Holman Christian Standard or the Christian Standard, I will use that at times. Like, I have different Bibles for different purposes. So the thing that I would come around to say is this, 2 kind of concluding thoughts as we land on this is saying, 1, you can trust your modern translations. And I mean translations, not paraphrases, not the Message, not the New Living, not the Amplified Bible. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about actual translations that go back to that Greek and the Hebrew, and they apply this formal or dynamic equivalency to their translations. You can trust the vast majority of English translations, especially the ones that I had displayed on the screen earlier of that continuum. You can trust them. The second thing I would say is read a Bible that you can understand. If you are reading a text and you literally cannot understand what it is that you are reading because of the density of the language or because it's 400 years old, then what benefit is that doing for you? This is not me in any way undercutting the validity that God will send His Spirit and that His Spirit will be able to give you all things to give you comprehension of what it is that He wants to teach you. But what I am saying very clearly is it's going to be a whole lot easier when you are reading something that you can comprehend immediately, and you don't have to get grammar and syntactical aids out for you so you can understand what that sentence even says in English. So if that's true, then get a translation that you can comprehend. Get one that's readily available to you. And if you have your eye on a Bible and that thing costs $300, get a different Bible, man. There's no reason for that. If you're wanting to get some kind of special cover and it's made out of a certain material, man, that's not what this is about. That's not what this is about. You can trust the modern translations, and you should get one that you can actually comprehend. That is the 2 most critical things for us. You can trust them, get one you can read. So with all that being said, I just want to remind us of all of our social media and all of our YouTube stuff. You should subscribe. You should ring the bell so you can get notifications for our YouTube posts. You should make sure you're following along on Instagram. A lot of this stuff's going to be coming out. We're going to be doing a lot more of stuff on YouTube and cranking out videos like this that are going to be instructional. They're going to be beneficial for us in our day-to-day walk with the Lord. If you've got questions, I would love to answer them. You can always get a hold of us either through our website. There's a page at the very bottom of the page. There's a way you can get a hold by just dropping us an email. I'll read every one of those. You can hit us up on our direct messages on Instagram or whatever method you want to send us, man. Mail me something, man. Send a carrier pigeon. I don't care. get a hold of us. We would love to have a conversation with you. So again, if you got questions, we'd love to get a hold of you. And until then, do good and don't sin.